But if anyone who's writing a research paper, and if you're in school, whether it's high school or college, at some point you're going to write a research paper, you're going to have to cite your sources. Different instructors use different methods. Some like APA. In English class, it's probably most likely going to be MLA. That's what I use. It's what I like. It's what I'm familiar with. So I'm going to show you how to do it. And this is pretty confusing for a lot of people, but I'm going to try and give you the basics. Okay, let's talk briefly about plagiarism. What is it? Plagiarism is the intentional or unintentional use of someone else's work or ideas as your own. And it's actually pretty serious. It can result in expulsion or some other type of discipline. I think a lot of the time when people plagiarize, they didn't actually mean to do it. They just forgot to cite their source. They weren't sure how to cite their source. Just don't take the risk. When in doubt, cite your source. If there's any question in your mind about whether you're using someone else's ideas, basically if it didn't come out of your own head, you had to get it from somewhere, wherever you got that from, cite the source. If you always cite your sources, then you don't have to be nervous about it. Okay, what is the MLA? It's the Modern Language Association, and I want to give you a great resource. It's called Purdue OWL, Purdue University, and OWL stands for Online Writing Lab, and here's the link. And I'm going to show you the most common sources, which are books and online articles, but there's a lot of different types of sources, and they have to be cited differently. So if you're not doing a book or an online article, I recommend you go to this website and it'll show you exactly how to do it. But for most people, most of the time, they're going to be using books or online articles. So those are the ones I want to go over. If I were to go over all of the different types, we'd be here all day. So let's just go over these two. Okay, so with an in-text citation, you've got the author's name, and it must appear either in the sentence or in the parentheses at the end. And we're going to look at examples of this. And the page number will always be in the parentheses. It will never be in the sentence. So let's look at, I'm going to show you 4 quotations, and they're all the same, but they're all a little bit different. So in this case, I just pulled this out of a paper I was writing. I'm introducing the author at the beginning, right? So best will suggest that. Then I've got a comma. A lot of people forget that. And then I've got my quotation. At the end of the quotation, I've got the page number. And then notice that the period goes at the very end of the parentheses. A lot of people want to put it inside the quotation marks because it looks more correct. And I understand because I kind of have that impulse also, but it's counterintuitive, but it actually has to go all the way at the end. So try and think of it like the page number is part of your sentence. Maybe that will help you. But the period always goes at the end. Here's another example. It's basically the same thing, except for style purposes, maybe I didn't want to actually introduce the author at the beginning of the quotation. Depending on how the wording is in the paragraph you're using, maybe you want to just run straight into the quotation. You don't want to be introducing the author at the beginning all the time, because that could get a little bit clunky. And I recommend that you mix up the way you do this, as I'm doing here. But I still have the author's name, but in this case, because I didn't introduce it at the beginning, it goes in the parentheses at the end. I still have the page number, and the period still goes outside the quotation marks at the very end. Now, if you don't want to use a direct quotation, but you're still conveying some kind of information that you found, that's basically a paraphrase. So if the information wasn't your own, you didn't know it yourself, you need to cite it, but it's not really a quotation. It's something that you read and then you're putting it into your own words. But I still have the author's name, and I still have the page number, and notice the period is still going at the end. But what's missing, as I'm sure you've noticed, is there's no quotation marks because I'm not actually using the exact words that Bestool used. I'm using my own. And here's another example of that. It's the same thing, except I didn't want to introduce the author's name at the beginning. I wanted it at the end, so it's going to go in the parentheses. So that seems maybe a little bit confusing, but it's really just the same sentence 4 different ways. And as I said before, I really recommend that you mix up the way you do this. Don't always use the author at the very beginning, or don't always use the author in the parentheses. Try and mix it up, because otherwise it can really start to sound really redundant. So let's talk about citing the sources. Here's the exception, and this is basically the only exception. If a phrase is common or universally known, such as a proverb, then no citation is needed, though quotation marks are still required. So for example, Aristotle advised like activities produce like dispositions. If you're using that in your paper, you don't actually have to cite where you found it, because it's a proverb or a common phrase. But it is someone else's words, so you're going to use the quotation marks. Again, when in doubt, if you did look it up, just cite the source. because you can get into this game where you're saying to yourself, well, it's pretty commonly known, maybe I don't really need to cite it. Don't play that game, because you can end up in a lot of trouble, and it's not worth it. It's too stressful. If you pulled it from something, just cite the source. If you already knew it in your own head and it just came to you, but you know it was someone else, use the quotation marks, but don't cite the source. So as I said, when in doubt, just cite the source. Okay, online source material. This is becoming more and more common. About 10 years ago, it wasn't really accepted in academic papers, but now it is more so. So basically, if you know the author, use it. If not, use the name or partial name of the website as the author. As I showed you in the previous examples, just use the name or partial name of the website in place of the author. You don't need to give paragraph numbers or page numbers. If it's online, there probably aren't any. Don't give the full URL in the text. It's sufficient to use, for example, CNN.com. You don't need to put http:// Now, here's the thing. MLA in 2009 actually changed the rules on this. You don't have to give the URLs anymore, but a lot of instructors are probably used to it, and they're probably going to want it anyway. The thing about MLA is they change a lot, so check with your instructor. Technically, the rules say you don't have to do that anymore, but so many people have done it for so long that you might have some explaining to do if you don't do it. So just check with your instructor on that. Legitimate online sources, scholarly articles will be easy to reference because the author will be clearly indicated. If you're having trouble finding the source info, it's probably not a good source to be using for academics. So if you've got some kind of article that you found online and you can't really figure out who the author is, probably don't use it then. Anything that's a legitimate scholarly source, it's going to be very clear who the author is because they want credit for their work. So if you're having trouble finding it, I would say just don't use it. Okay, let's talk about two style points. This is for the in-text citations. If the quotation is 4 lines of prose or less, or 3 if it's verse, use the format that I just showed you, where you have the quotation, you have the parentheses, and you have the page number. If it's longer, you need to indent. You remove the quotation marks and you place the punctuation before the parenthetical citation. So as you see here, for example, if in your paper you had the sentence, in this sense it is the sacrifice, not the epiphany, that defines the tragic, that blue line would basically be the margin of your paper, and that's the margin that's set by your word processor. What you're going to have to do is you take that chunk of a quotation that you want to use, and you have to indent the whole thing so that it lines up, and just use your tab key. And notice the quotation marks are gone, and that's because by indenting it, I'm indicating that it is a quotation. And you've still got the period, but notice now it's moved. Now it's on the other side of the parentheses. So this is where it gets a little hairy. If it's just one line, it's going to be quotation marks and the period's going to go on the outside of the parentheses. If it's a block quote like this, it's called block quoting. It's going to be indented, which is going to indicate that it is a quote, so you don't need quotation marks, and the period goes on the other side. This, like I said, this stuff is confusing. Just use the website I showed you, Purdue OWL. That will help you if you forget. But the more you do this, it almost becomes second nature, and you don't really have to think about it that much. Okay, if you add a word or words in a quotation, you should put brackets around the words to indicate that they're not part of the original text. So if you are introducing something into the quotation that maybe was clear in the text, but because you've taken a chunk out of the text, you've lifted it, and you're putting it in your paper, it's maybe not clear what the author was referring to, or you want to just add some kind of clarification of your own, use brackets. So the quotation actually from the book was and then I can't remember, it was, but it wasn't specifically Gower, Chaucer, and Langland. Bestill referred to somebody, and then he said, like, you know, probably medieval authors, Hilton is a practitioner of the vernacular. Well, I didn't feel like that was clear enough, but I knew what he was talking about because I'd read the article. So I introduced more specific information, so you always want to put it in brackets, but otherwise the rules don't change about where the periods go and where the quotations go. That's basics. That's the basics. Like I said, there's a ton of different ways to do it. Check out that website. It will really help you. But I hope that at least gives you enough to move forward.